Ready to cozy up your space this fall? Wisconsin Home Goods has just what you need. Hand-poured soy candles crafted in small batches, made to burn clean, and scented with the warm, comforting notes of the season. Stop by their shop at 4664 Cottage Grove Road on Madison's beautiful east side, or browse their fall collection online at wiscohomegoods.com. Shop local, breathe easy, feel good. All autumn long with Wisco Home Goods. Word to the wise, the cold always comes faster than you think. That's why Cardinal is rewarding the early birds. Book your furnace tune-up for just $119 if you do it by September 15th. After October 1st, it's $149. And trust me, you don't want to wait until then. A broken furnace isn't just inconvenient, it's chaos. Smart homeowners get ahead of it. Cardinal's the team Madison trusts to keep homes warm. Book online at cardinalservice.com or call 608-218-3895. This is CityCast Madison. I'm Bianca Martin, and here's what Madison's talking about. Today, our city's housing crisis is worsening, and seasonal change is bringing cold weather in. Once again, Madison's management of unhoused populations is under review. Joining me now is one of the key players working to address homelessness on the ground, Brenda Conkle, Executive Director of Madison Street Medicine. Brenda, thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thanks, Bianca.
Yeah, so there's been, unfortunately, a number of recent stories about the city's response to local unhoused population dwellings. A little over a week ago, Madison police shut down a homeless encampment in the downtown area between the Capitol and State Street. Meanwhile, the city is in active talks right now to either close or extend operations at the temporary homeless encampment site on Madison's far east side, dubbed Dairy Drive. That's the around 30 shelter site set up as a temporary resource during COVID. Brenda, how would you describe the current state of affairs for the unhoused in our city and the need for housing?
Yeah, it feels like we took a step backwards 10 years in time. It feels like we're back in 2016. Things I remember about that time was, Paul Soglin was removing benches from State Street. They were kicking people out from sleeping in front of the city county building. They were talking about giving people bus tickets to leave town. It feels like we literally taken that big of a step backwards. And I think it's so disappointing because during COVID, we were able to make a lot of progress, and we actually saw our homeless numbers going down. We had a lot of additional funds coming into the community. And we were able to do some really good things with that funding, which really showed that with resources, we can do better, right? And it feels like we're sort of now backing back up to where we were before. And it's a huge disappointment. And it's sad to see that many of the things that we were able to do during COVID and with the COVID funds that we had available, it feels like it's all being undone at this point.
Brenda, I remember that time as well, and it was a really chilling moment. It felt very un-Madison to be hearing about these stories and for the city to be taking those actions. And, this thought, is it that there's a whole bunch of people coming in from out of state? What is bringing this sort of extreme reaction? And, we know that it's a little bit complicated, but this is still a headline. And this is people's lives when they're removed from downtown. You lead Madison Street Medicine, a social support nonprofit, very embedded in the scene. You essentially run the Dairy Drive site, which we're going to dive into that deeper in a moment about what's happening there. But the State Street crackdown isn't the kind of headline that we see every day in Madison. I have to imagine these events are and have been happening, though, without fanfare. Are these kinds of sweeps becoming more common in Madison? Can you help put this into context?
Yeah, I think one of the things that happened early on in COVID is they let people camp in the parks. And there was a big encampment that developed out at Rindall Park. And ever since then, the police department has definitely been on a mission. If there are more than 8 people gathered in one spot, they're going to try to break it up and move people along. I think if there's 1 or 2 people sleeping here or 3 or 4 people sleeping there, they don't really so much care. But when it starts to get a little bit bigger, I think they're very afraid that something like Rindall Park could happen again. That, if everybody gathered in one spot, it would become a problem for the city. So I think the police department has been more vigilant. I also think it changes with captains, right? Our captains in each of the districts change every couple years. There's sort of a rotation that they go through. And I think different captains approach things differently. We also have a different police chief now. All of those things play into it, I think.
Hmm. And so this recent incident, is this a part of a larger sweep? Is this something kind of a new thing you're seeing, or it's been steady since the Rindell Park encampment grew very large?
Yeah, I think it's been steady, but I do think that in the downtown area, they put a lot of pressure on the beacon to make sure that people weren't hanging out around there after hours. They put a lot of pressure on the Salvation Army, make sure people weren't hanging out around in that neighborhood. They put pressure on the Social Justice Center and make sure people aren't hanging out here. I think there's been some other apartment complexes that have sort of been mm, I'd say targeted by the police to try to make sure that there's not too many people hanging out there. So I think it's been sort of a steady pattern that has been developing over time. It feels weird to be in the middle of it all right now because it seems like for the last few years it wasn't as targeted, in the places that I was working in. But depending upon the officers that respond to certain situations, I think it's sort of been an ongoing thing where if they see, if there's more than 10, they are definitely going to break that up and move people along.
And why do police do this? Because, we heard a little bit about the State Street area, like right at the top of State Street by the Capitol, that there are businesses making complaints. Is that one of the reasons? Like, why is this intervention necessary in the police's mindset?
Yeah, I do think it's mostly business complaints, sometimes neighbor complaints, but it feels like mostly business complaints, especially around the Beacon and in the downtown area, even over here in the Willie Street area. It has been primarily, I think, businesses that have been complaining, although there are also some neighbors for sure.
Hmm. So when people get cleared out of these spaces, where can they go?
There really is no legal place for people to sleep outside in Madison. Either you're trespassing on private property, or if you're on city property, usually there's rules or ordinances that prevent you from sleeping wherever you're at, such as in parks or by the city county building and other places. And then really the only place you can sleep is between the sidewalk and the street. They call that the terrace. And that's why people can sleep around the Capitol Square more often because there's a pretty wide terrace up there. Part of the reason why they sleep outside the Social Justice Center as well. But, there's very limited places that people can legally exist.
Mm. Well, I mentioned it at the start of this episode. Madison Street Medicine has a contract with the city to operate the tiny house campground at 3202 Dairy Drive. And according to the city, the tiny house community at Dairy Drive was expected to operate for 2 years when it opened in 2021. 4 years later, it's still running. This is one of the spaces that's sanctioned, and the city wants to shut it down. Let's get some context about the site. As the administrator, y'all over at Madison Street Medicine, can you tell us a little bit about the site and what you've managed to accomplish there?
Sure. So this site has 29 cabins. They're just 8 by 8 square foot cabins with just the bare minimum. There's electricity, there's heat, there's air conditioning, there's 2 beds, and that's about it. I mean, it's pretty basic, but it is, it's a space where people can sleep, they can lock their door, they have a place to call their own temporarily. They don't have to worry about where they're going to sleep at night, where their food's going to come from. We provide transportation for laundry and other things like that. So, we do a lot of things in hopes of, people reaching their housing goals. And we work with each of the campers individually to try to meet whatever goals that they have. Sometimes we were like, I have to get off probation before I can get a landlord to rent to me. We work with each person individually to come up with a plan that works for them. One of the things about our campground is that we take the people who are at the top of the priority list for the Homeless Services Consortium, and they prioritize people based on like a triage method, and they determine who is the most vulnerable. And so we take all of the most vulnerable people, typically the people who are the hardest to house, and we are working with them. They all came off the streets. They weren't staying in shelter. They were, sleeping outside, unsheltered. And we work with those folks and for as long as it takes to get them into housing. And we've had a remarkable success rate. 77% have exited to positive destinations. For outreach programs, we're supposed to hit 40%. So 77% is a really great number. I mean, it was unexpected even by us. We run it with CABA Recovery Services or CABA Inc. And we've all been surprised by the results. But we take a very individual approach. We work with people at their pace. And we've had over 100 people stay there. So we feel like we're doing really well for really the limited amount of resources. They keep talking about how expensive it is, but it really isn't much more expensive per bed than it is for the men's shelter.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about the men's shelter briefly, but staying on the Dairy Drive site. It was a product of the pandemic, right? So the city created individual dwellings to help stop the spread of COVID-19. You already kind of laid out there's not really places for people to go. Is there any other site like this in Madison, in Dane County?
No, there's not. I mean, and I'm also involved with Occupy Madison, and we went through this. Like I said, I feel like we're stepping back 10 years because we went through this. We went to every place that you could possibly go and got kicked out of everywhere, right? And so, like, it really is, there is no legal place to go. There is no other place like this. There's no other campground in the city of Madison that people could go camp at. And even to try to reset something like this up, I think it'd be really difficult to get zoning for it. It'd be difficult to find the money to fund it. It would be a very huge uphill climb.
Yeah, I remember those times around Occupy and the dwellings going up and people having to move. And yeah, that was quite the moment. I do want to emphasize the point that Dairy Drive started during the pandemic to stop the spread of COVID-19. I imagine that having a site like that for unexpected things like infectious disease outbreaks might also come in handy down the line.
Absolutely. And we really are experiencing an aging population within the homeless population. And we have a lot of people who have medical issues and medical concerns that really do need some more individualized attention. And I do think that the future of Dairy Drive very much could be towards, the people who have those medical issues that need some place to make sure that they're sleeping inside, people who get frostbite in the wintertime, people who are recovering from surgery, people who, can't get surgery because they have no place to recover. There's lots of things going out there for folks. And homeless people die 20 to 30 years sooner than the average American. So a lot of people are not in good health to begin with. And even when they do get health care, they don't get quality health care and they don't get quality follow-up. And so I do think that, there's lots of possibilities for what Dairy Drive could be.
Yeah. And I'm sure for folks listening, it's probably clear that you are a proponent of Dairy Drive staying open. The site was scheduled for demolition later this year. The city wants to carry out the temporary part of this dwelling and close it down, particularly considering the lack of renewing federal funds to support it. Demolition is set to cost about $220,000, which has been budgeted within the Community Development Division. Another reason, as you just brought up, that I wanted to share is about the men's shelter and the city wanting to prioritize funds and support going towards that, which is scheduled to open next year. If Dairy Drive site is closed, say tomorrow, hypothetically, where would folks go? What are the options? What does that look like?
I think for most of our folks, they're not people who use shelter. Right now, they can get into shelter. In the spring, when they start having a hard 250 limit of people who can get into the shelter, they won't even be able to get into the shelter. So I think a lot of folks will return to camping out in the woods somewhere, or coming back to State Street, maybe coming to the area around the Social Justice Center or the Beacon or all the places that the police keep clearing them from. And I just feel like we're just chasing our tails, right? We're just going around in circles and we're not making any progress. And we were really hoping that we could get a meeting with like the mayor and the Community Development Division and the police department and, even the Parks Department and public health and all the different entities that come together around homeless issues and talk about like sometimes community development is funding an organization and at the same time the police is like harassing that organization, right? And so like how can we get everybody to actually come together and figure out what a plan is? And it just doesn't seem like there's the willingness to have even that kind of a meeting. And I think it's because people know there are no answers here.
Fall's about to be busy, y'all, and I'm getting on my grind. Working out in the AMs or truly whatever I can get them in. The one thing I wish I had more of is time, particularly in the mornings. Fortunately, Huel gets that too. Huel, spelled Huel, their Black Edition powder is a complete meal, so you feel full, focused, and ready for your day. I'm someone who spends so much time adding ingredients to my smoothies, and Huel cuts that prep down to almost nothing. At less than $3 per meal, it's packed with 40 grams of plant-based protein and 27 essential vitamins and minerals. And just when you thought Huel had everything covered, they just dropped a first-of-its-kind Super Greens drink in a can. This is your daily greens, 42 vitamins, minerals, and superfoods, only 25 calories, 4 grams of fiber, 1 gram of sugar, made by dietitians. Try Huel with 15% off for new customers today using our code Madison at Huel.com/Madison. Fuel your best performance with Huel today. I saw a quote that you gave to WKOW 27 about the MPD's recent removal of the homelessness encampment. You said, quote, "Everybody is looking to our city and county leaders to try to find some sort of a solution, but it seems to be wrapped up in the budget discussions. Money is kind of where it's at. It's like, it would be ideal if we could keep both, but the city is looking to prioritize the men's shelter and looking to close this down." You're saying this is something that we need. Let's find a way to not close this down. But being that it's getting caught up in budget discussions, are you suggesting that we find a solution now and figure it out how to pay for it later? Or what are you suggesting? Or is it truly there's no good answer?
There's a couple of things wrapped up in there, but we have presented a plan that only asks the city for $179,500 a year for the next 4 years. We proposed that in the RFP process. That did not get recommended for funding. But that's a very small amount of money to the city compared to, when you think about the police budget being, 80, 90 million, whatever it's up to now. When you think about, how much money they're spending on transit, how much money they're spending on these other things, less than $200,000 isn't a lot of money each year. Given that the program has had such a huge success rate, and it's getting results, it's got to be saving the city that much money per year in, police calls and ambulance calls and all kinds of, expenses that the city would otherwise have. They're not cleaning up encampment sites. They're not doing other things like that. So I do think that it's like a very good value for the money, given that it's such a small amount. What's happening is the city is saying the county should pay for it. County's saying the city should pay for it. And both of them are looking at each other, wondering who's going to pay for what. And that's why it's kind of gotten caught between the city and the county. And I do think, oddly enough, there's more support on the county side right now than there is on the city side.
Yeah, it's interesting. I saw, reporting from Angiana Nerdine at the Cap Times had a quote from someone working at the city saying operating Dairy Drive would cost the city $900,000 in its first year. And that maintaining the site costs about like $50,000 a month. So I think that's part of it too, is sort of the assessments. It seems like it's cost around like $4.5 million since it started. So, if you all were putting a proposition of, $200K, I'm sorry for all of us having so much numbers in here, but where's the discrepancy there?
Part of the $4.5 million is the $1.2 million that they used to set it up, right? So that's one big part of the discrepancy there, is that's not all operating costs, I don't believe. And it did cost us more in the beginning, because in the beginning, we had things we had to buy. We had to buy refrigerators and microwaves and all kinds of things to, get the site set up. So it did cost more in the first year. We also, over time, have learned a lot. And so we've shifted our staffing patterns. And we also have been able to just create efficiencies. I got to tell you, the new bus passes have saved us a ton of money, because we were paying $65 a month per camper to be able to get a 31-day bus pass. And now, most campers are only costing $15 to $20 a month because of the new system. So, there's been lots of efficiencies. We're working more with Second Harvest Food Bank to get food for folks. And we were able to get funding from HUD. So we get $200,000 a year from HUD to run the campground as well. So there was a lot of things that evolved over time.
Well, that's good to hear. And that makes sense. So you're like, we're getting smarter with time, and we were smart in the beginning. And now, we could do this for less. I think that's a big point to underscore. You mentioned that it feels like the city and the county are looking at each other and pointing, like, who's going to do this? There has been another development in this story. District 6 Alder Davey Mayer recently introduced a resolution to, again, extend the life of Dairy Drive using county funds just into next year. Do you know about that effort? Can you tell us about it? And is that a feasible solution? I think they're looking to get around $100,000 in funding from the county authorized to help.
Between our HUD funding, $100,000, and we saved some of the money in the beginning of the year because we started making those changes already. That would be enough to get us through April. We may have to do a little bit of fundraising. It was unclear to us how much the utilities and some other things that the city is currently paying. It was unclear to us how much of that cost would come over to us. But we feel like between the funding sources we already have and a little bit of fundraising, we would be able to keep it open through April.
Okay. And is the hope or appeal to keep this as what was once thought as temporary, but to be a permanent place in Madison for folks?
I think that is really the best answer. And again, this is a population that's not getting served by anybody else. These are the same folks that we would serve in our outreach program, except for in our outreach program, we'd be running all over the city trying to find people all the time. So this is a much more efficient way to provide services to this population. And it's proven to be a very effective program. It's far more effective than our outreach programs are. And we run those programs too. So it's not about the provider or the training or the way we're doing it or anything. It really is, I think, about having a base, a home base, a location where people can, get themselves back up on their feet.
You mentioned at the top of the conversation how you and others were pretty surprised, like how successful you've been able to be. As promised, I want to come back to the men's shelter. Proponents of the demolition of Dairy Drive say the city's time and effort is better spent focused on the forthcoming men's shelter on Bartillon Drive, which will be able to house about 250 men. That shelter is expected to open next year, overseen by Porchlight. Brenda, you've worked as an alder and understand city budgets. Does this have to be an either-or situation, that one resource must go for another to operate? It seems like you said things are really lost in the budgetary conversations and, plans that have been laid out and how to move forward, the sort of like capital budgets versus the operational budgets and how do we move funds? Does this have to be an either-or situation?
I don't think that it does, and I don't understand why they're being pitted against each other. They're asking the city to pay $1.5 million for the men's shelter, which is about $6,000 a bed. We're asking them for $179,500 for 29 beds, which is, $6,189. It's about the same amount of money per bed. But at the men's shelter, 10% of the people are moving to positive destinations, whereas at Dairy Drive is 77%. Now, part of that, I think, is the shelter is doing a better job. They're just not collecting their data well, but I don't think they're anywhere near the 77%. So if we really want to get people off the street, if we really want to end the cycle of homelessness, and we really want to give people a chance to really change their lives, I think the Dairy Drive model for the same dollar amount, essentially, I think is a much better deal for the city.
There's no question about it. Homelessness is a multifaceted issue that needs to be addressed with a multifaceted approach. In your experience, is there anything the city, county, or local nonprofits haven't really tried yet to help address homelessness in Madison? Are there other parties, including the private sector, who could step in more to achieve, sort of sustainable solutions?
I do think that in other cities and communities, the private sector does step in more and donates more money. In Milwaukee and other areas, even in Wisconsin, I think you see a lot more philanthropy. I think that is one factor. I do think that we need to stop being afraid of campgrounds. I do think that car campers need a place to be able to stay and be able to, plug in and get some resources as well. And I do think that, every year we still have quite a few people sleeping outside in the wintertime. And if we had a safe place where people could congregate and call that their space, I think that would be much more effective. Even at Dairy Drive, we have recommendations for improvements if it were to continue a little bit longer. But, I think the city did a very good job during COVID. We tried a lot of things. Some of them worked, most of them worked, but then the funding ran out, right? And so I think really it's about a commitment of resources. And when we're talking about Dairy Drive, it's the cost of 2 police officers a year. But when you think about it, it also might be saving that much money for the police department because, they're not chasing people around. They're not making people move. They're not arresting them for things that other people wouldn't get arrested for. People don't have a place to go to the bathroom. People don't, if they have an argument, it's not a private argument. The whole neighborhood hears it. And all those types of things that people who live in houses take for granted.
Well, the outcome is not set in stone, right? And we mentioned Alder Mayer has put forth this resolution to hopefully get funds from the county. That's going to be going before the Common Council. I understand there's a meeting on September 16th, so coming right up, where folks will continue to discuss that proposal and just what Dairy Drive needs and the discussion around whether to extend Dairy Drive or close it. Is there anything else that we are missing in this conversation that we haven't yet covered?
The Homeless Services Consortium does do a 5-year plan to prevent and end homelessness. And when we did that plan, a lot of things have changed since that point. And I don't see a plan moving forward when only 250 men can go to the shelter and there's 400 people that had been sleeping there last year. Where are those other 150 people going to go? What is the plan? Where are people supposed to go? If they don't want people here and they don't want people there, where do they want people to go to? And those are 2 questions I have not heard an answer to yet. So where are the 150 people who can't get into shelter going to go? And if you're sleeping outside, where do they want you to sleep?
Yeah, I pulled some county data that said nearly 800 people were recorded as homeless in a volunteer-conducted survey that was for January 2025, a point-in-time survey, compared to 630 people in 2020. So it does really feel like the need is expanding. And, leadership needs to come together to address it and handle it in a humane, thoughtful, human-forward way.
Yeah, nationwide, we've seen an 18% increase in homelessness last year and a 7% increase here. That's not going to go away. These are the times we're living in. We all know how unaffordable the housing is in Madison. We see what's going on at the national level. We see all the funding cuts and other things that are happening to some of the folks that are providing the services. It keeps me awake at night for sure, thinking about what is going to happen in the next year and how are we going to have the ability to respond to it in a meaningful way that's actually going to help people move out of homelessness.
Brenda, I really appreciate you taking the time to come on the show and share with us the pulse from the ground and the work that you're doing and help us get a better understanding of Dairy Drive and the operations there as the city continues to have a conversation about its future. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
That's Brenda Conkle, Executive Director of Madison Street Medicine. That's all for today here on CityCast Madison. I'm Bianca Martin, your host. Don't forget, you can support the show and get great perks by becoming a CityCast Madison neighbor at membership.citycast.fm. And if you enjoyed today's show, if it meant something to you, why not share this episode with someone who cares about housing their community? All right, we'll be back tomorrow morning with more stories from around the city. Until then, take good care.